Killing O'Carolan by Walt Pilcher. Killing O'Carolan follows on from the escapades of reluctant private investigator Mark Fairley in The Accidental Spurt. After his adventures in Spurville, Fairley swore never to take on another case. This is it. Someone is poisoning poets in Greensborough, and there seems to be no rhyme or reason to it. With no enthusiasm for the role, Mark Fairley goes undercover in the arts community to learn whose muse has run amok and to restore poetic justice to the city. All is well and good until he discovers the future of this modern American town may hinge on the fate of a legendary 18th century blind Irish musician and a hitman with a chip on his shoulder.
An excerpt from Killing O'Carolan, a Mark Fairley mystery, by Walt Pilcher, read by the author. Prologue. He is alone in a men's restroom at the Stephen Tanger Center for the Performing Arts. A Broadway touring company is performing The Wiz on the main stage, and he can hear the music from speakers concealed in the restroom ceiling. It is a good show, but he has had to leave his front row seat before the intermission and come here. Too much wine at the pre-show VIP reception, he supposes, and ruining the day he ever heard the disgusting expression he now can't get out of his head. He needs to take a whiz himself. Finished, he goes to wash his hands, but what's this? 2 cigars in dark green wrappers on the floor in one of the stalls? He hesitates. Are they clean enough to touch? After all, they are on the floor of a public restroom. But this is a high-class public restroom, so maybe they are okay. He bends and picks them up. He sees they are not cigars, but rather 2 of those cheap fountain pens Dylan Vivaldi has distributed all over town, promoting the Gate City Playhouse, a competitor of the Tanger Center. He has 2 of them already, though he does not recall when or where he got them. He lays the pens on top of a wash basin while he washes his hands, and then he wipes each one with a damp paper towel. They have been on the floor of a public restroom, after all. He pockets them, clean enough now, fleetingly thinking they seem a little heavier than the other Gate City Playhouse pens he's collected. No matter, they're probably made in China, where quality consistency is not always a priority. He exits the restroom without noticing the ceiling speakers have gone silent. There is a commotion in the theater. He stops an usher who tells him 2 of the actors have collapsed on the stage. He asks if it is part of the act. The usher says it is not. It is, however, literally a showstopper. People begin shouting and running for the exits, blocking his path back to his seat. Above the noise of the crowd, he hears sirens. Somehow he manages to collect his wife and leave just as a fire truck, 2 ambulances, and 3 police cars arrive.
Yes, I do know Walt Pilcher's books, but no, actually I haven't read all of them. I have possibly read all his long fiction though. I've certainly read all the books he's published with Fantastic Books Publishing. The first book of Walt's I read was called On Shallowed Ground. It's a collection of short pieces, the short stories, there's verse, there's all sorts, there's some original art in there as well. As I say that, I do wonder, I can't remember now, some years since I've read it, whether that art is actually Walt's or whether it's his wife Carol's. I know she's the artist in the family. That's something I shall go and check. Now I know that Walt is retired now, living in North Carolina, but he has worked around the world and he has quite the writing CV. He's written a lot of business books. I don't know whether they're textbooks or not, but I'm fairly certain he's won some awards for them. Sort of things that I think I would probably enjoy reading, although I actually haven't as yet. What strikes me about Walt, there's one thing that always comes to mind when I think of Walt and his writing, and that's a story he relates about a teacher who made an impression on him, not surprisingly, at junior school. This teacher at some point, and I can't remember why, and I don't know if the pupils even knew why, hurled an African spear across the room. He was making a point of one sort or another, and in the process he demolished a bookcase. And Walt said he took a lesson from that, the lesson being, you can't make this stuff up. And he's kind of used that in his writing ever since. I know he went on to do quite a lot of broadcasting. I think he was quite a leading light at his college and university, the broadcasting, but then he went on into the business world. He ended up managing a firm called Legs, that's L''eggs. It's pantyhose in plastic eggs. It's a firm I've never heard of, but it turns out it was really big, or is really big in the States. So there you go. On Walt and his business writing and how it was in the business world, I believe he's worked right round the world. He got as far as the Far East, I think. I've heard him relating an anecdote about his time at Legs when he was interviewed on the book show. I can't tell it as well as Walt can tell it, so I'm not even going to try. I'm certain that the recording of his book show interview will be within sight or sound of wherever this recording is, so it'll be there for you to find. After On Shallow Ground, in fiction terms, Walt graduated to novels, and I was very interested to read his first novel, because what would somebody who could put together a collection like On Shallow Ground make of a novel? What on earth would it be? It was called Everybody Shrugged, and it's billed as being about government overreach on steroids, and it is. It's a very funny book. It really showcases Walt's talent for parody and the absurd, and indeed parody of the absurd. I do recommend it. It's one of these books where there are contradictory aims and ambitions of the various people who are running the various threads within the books, and it's one of these things that it kind of becomes more chaotic and it becomes more tangled as the whole thing builds and builds towards an explosive climax. It's very, very good. Very much recommend that. Now, then Walt's next move was to go on to crime novels, and he produced one called The Accidental Spurt, which is well, essentially straight crime, private investigator fiction, and it's set in a bottling plant. And it introduces a private investigator called Mark Fairley. Now, in The Accidental Spurt, Mark Fairley is billed as a reluctant private investigator, and he's basically somebody who's between jobs. He really needs to have something because he needs to have some money coming in, and he gets a temporary gig as kind of archivist, looking into the archives of this company in order to write the company history, which is, fine. And from there, he gets pulled in to some very shady things that are going on in the background. There is that Walt Pilcher thread runs throughout. He doesn't lose his talent for parody and the absurd. You might hear that African spear whistling through the air at times. But there is a very dramatic and gripping story goes throughout. It was very good. Now, the latest book of Walt's that's come out is, in fact, the next in this series. It is the next Mark Fairley mystery, and it's called Killing O'Carolan. And it's brilliant. I think it's Walt's best yet. Now, I was very, should I say concerned? I was certainly curious to know how Walt was going to deal with Mark Fairley, given that in The Accidental Spurt, Mark Fairley had been pulled very reluctantly into his private investigation role. It really, really wasn't something he wanted to do. And the results of it were not such that he was going to go and look for another gig like that. So how do you actually do that? How do you credibly pull the same person back into a world that they have clearly left behind them with a sigh of relief? Now, in some other people's books I've read about these sort of things, they don't bother giving it a backstory. They simply pick up their person, they just land them in the next situation and they go. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I prefer it when people make a bit of an effort with it. Walt has actually done it brilliantly. He has used the backstory of the accidental spurt within Killing O'Carolan, and that it is that backstory that has actually pulled Mark Fairley back into this role as Private Eye. Now, in this case, he goes directly there. He doesn't go in via another job, but he goes in a rather dodgy sort of a situation, but it's not one he can get out of. It's done really, really well, that side of it. I mean, it's almost incidental to the book, but the way it's done it is so smooth, and you can see this is someone who's very, very accomplished with words and ideas and structures and putting things together. And like all the best series, you could read Killing O'Carolan as a standalone novel. I would say, if you can, read them both and read them in order. I think it's one of those series that's probably best read in order, because they certainly, one does build on the other, but they both work fine. Now, one thing I noticed about Killing O'Carolan is that he is actually now embedded in the, as it were, the creative community, and that really is the target of his parodies in this particular book. So he is not only parodying the poets, as it were, but he's parodying the poets of Greensboro, North Carolina. And of course that's the very community in which he lives, in which he writes. And you can't help wondering what his contemporaries think of this. Of course, Walt, like so many other authors, would never say that any of his characters are based on real people, or if they are, who they're based on. But with what I've learnt about Walt, having listened to him talk in interviews and read a fair bit of what he's written and read about him and so on, I suspect that within Walt's particular creative community, it's probably a badge of honour to be able to say, that character was based on me. And I imagine the poets and the creatives of Greensboro, North Carolina, actually vying for the honour of actually being the one who's been parodied in Walt's latest work. Of course, I could be wrong. And I'm sure that Walt just sits back and never actually lets slip any of the secrets about that. So we have The Accidental Spurt, we have Killing O'Carolan, which were both great. I have no idea where Mark Fairley is going to go next within this. He hasn't been left in the terribly stable sort of a situation at the end of it. I would say he's not entirely out of trouble. So there clearly is somewhere for him to go. And I'm really hoping that this time next year I'll be able to talk about the third Mark Fairley book and how good that is, and what a wonderful sequel that is to Killing O'Carolan. I should possibly mention the themes of them and how they're very different, which I think is another real strength of Walt's writing. We have the same character running through them, but The Accidental Spurt set in the world of fizzy drinks, and it's quite a cutthroat world it turns out to be, but it's a world that Walt knows about and writes about very well. We then go on to the creative community, Killing O'Carolan, And the O'Carolan of the title is Turlough O'Carolan, who was a 17th century, I hope I've got the date right, Irish harpist. And a play has been written about him. And this somehow becomes the focal point of this new book. And we actually get to see little bits of this play throughout. But the story itself is quite a drama, even though it is going to make you laugh along the way. It is clearly a parody. It's Walt knows how to write drama, how to keep you at the edge of your seat, to know quite what happens, as do all the best mystery writers. So, Walt, if you're listening to this, we're looking forward to number 3. I do hope it's underway.
Mark Henderson reviews Killing O'Carolan by Walt Pilcher. If you believed that Walt Pilcher couldn't produce another book as simultaneously witty, mystifying, and engaging as The Accidental Spurt, think again. The second Mark Fairley story, Killing O'Carolan, is every bit as much of a winner as the first. We meet many of the same characters: Mark's intelligent and long-suffering wife Emily, Lieutenant Blue with his unrivaled capacity for malapropisms and confused sayings, and that paragon of capitalism, Bob Auslander. The setting is once again Greensboro, North Carolina, but this time the action centers on the multifaceted Greensboro arts community, and particularly the Gate City Playhouse. The Playhouse is planning a production of a musical comedy, The Christmas O'Carolan Songbook, Volume 1. Christmas O'Carolan being the fictitious son of the celebrated blind harper Turlough O'Carolan, who, as a matter of historical fact, engaged in a composition competition with Arcangelo Corelli during the early 18th century. The comedy, we're told, is set against a background of national sadness, potatoes, and alcohol. But someone or something is causing members of the Greensboro arts community, particularly around the Playhouse, to suffer accidents or illness in public. Typically, they try to swallow the nearest solid object, vomit, lose consciousness, and then recover in hospital with no lasting after effects. No poison can be identified. Who or what is causing these misfortunes, and why? Certainly to the outsider, they're having an adverse effect on the quality of life in the town. The production of the Christmas O'Carolan Songbook, Volume 1, is under threat. Could these tribulations affecting the arts community have anything to do with the promotional fountain pens that the Playhouse is giving away? And how, if at all, might a hush-hush company in Chicago be involved? In addition to the convoluted puns and other delights of wordplay we've come to expect of this author, there are absurd names worthy of Jasper Fforde and runaway fantasies on particular themes that recall Dickens at his most let your hair down. Chapter 8 provides an outstanding example, a fantasy on dictionary definitions of community and tribe. Who knew that dictionary entries could be such wellsprings of humor? And then there's the delightful evocation in Chapter 1 of an unemployed person's life. My calendar looks like winter in Nebraska, flat, white, and blank. Near the end of the book, when a gunman in the back seat of a car threatens the driver, there's a whole paragraph describing the thoughts that flash through the driver's mind, at once hilarious and wholly believable. As ever, Mr. Pilcher's way with language is quirky, idiosyncratic, clever, and great fun. To add to the novel's entertainment value, there's an appendix comprising a collection of the fictitious Christmas O'Carolan songs, both words and music, and some of them attributed to a fictional alter ego invented by the fictional Christmas. Metafiction, I suppose. Killing O'Carolan is a quick, easy read, but it merits a second reading so you can pick up the witty asides you might have missed the first time. It worked that way for me.
Killing O'Carolan by Walt Pilcher. A book review by Stuart Aiken. Subtitled A Mark Fairley Mystery, This humorous novel follows the reluctant emerging PI on his journey to solve the apparently unsolvable after his unlikely success in The Accidental Spurt. As a parody of the genre, this will entertain those who take their crime fiction with a cellarful of salt. The O'Carolan of the title is the fictional son of a real Irish musician, one Turlough O'Carolan, a blind Celtic harper from Meath, born in 1670. Whether you sympathise with the attempt to kill his fictional son, drawn with sympathy, compassion, and a touch of necessary cynicism by the author, will depend on your attitude to music. But whether you're fan or critic, I'm sure you'll enjoy this complex tale of misadventure strewn with red herrings. The characters, some of whom we met in the earlier book, are well constructed, and some are even likeable. The book devotes pages to the play within the novel, bearing the same title, and the script is peppered with the sort of insulting or patronising comments that certain comedians employ as humour in their stand-up routines. This is essential to the plot, as it drives one of the antagonists to extreme action. One of the stars of the story is an inanimate object with the power to damage the reputations of those unfortunate enough to fall foul of its malign power. As you'd expect in a book of this sort, where science is not as important as motivation, the science behind the device is, shall we say, questionable? Nevertheless, it's sufficiently plausible for most readers to continue to read the compelling story. I found myself smiling, grinning, sniggering, and occasionally laughing out loud, much to the surprise of those seated with me at the time. And those with a musical bent will undoubtedly enjoy the opportunity to join in with the songs, which are presented with their full lyrics and sometimes a musical score. I don't read music, so contented myself with the fun of the words. It's an entertaining read, with many of the features so frequently considered essential to the American novel: details of clothes worn, descriptions of food devoured, and detailed descriptions of both commonplace and unique locations of events. This, of course, is provided in the spirit of the parody element of the novel and works well. Having read and enjoyed The Accidental Spurt, I expected to enjoy this book and was not disappointed.
An excerpt from Killing O'Carolan, a Mark Fairley mystery by Walt Pilcher, read by the author. Chapter 6. Typical of many to follow, this first 911 call had come at 7:32 p.m. on a Saturday from a cell phone at the Read a Spell bookstore downtown during an open mic poetry reading event.
What is your emergency?
She's just lying there.
Yes, ma'am. What is the location?
On the floor.
No, I mean, what is your location? What address are you calling from?
It looked like she was trying to swallow the microphone, and then she threw up and fell down.
Please calm down, ma'am, and tell me exactly where you are.
Okay. I'm standing about 10 feet from the back door right now, near the children's section. But when it happened, I was near self-help. It's horrible, but thank God I didn't get any of it on me. I got out of the way just in time. Now everybody's calling 911.
Yes, I know. All right, ma'am, the GPS has you, and I'm dispatching the EMTs and the police. They should arrive in about 7 minutes.
Oh, my. I think she's dead.
Is anyone trying to help her? Does anyone there know how to perform CPR?
Well, no one wants to get too close to her because, well, you know, the mess and all. We don't know what to do.
All right, ma'am, please stay calm and stay on the line until help arrives. May I have your name, please?
Her poem wasn't that bad.
What is your name, please, ma'am?
The poet wasn't dead. The EMTs took her to the hospital. The police interviewed the witnesses, not only those who were attending the monthly open mic event put on by the local writers group, but also the customers in the bookstore at the time. Everybody said the same thing. It looked like she was trying to swallow the microphone, and then she threw up and fell down. Nobody saw anything else. She spent the night in the hospital and went home on bed rest for 2 days with a monster headache. Tuesday, she was back at work as a cashier at Target. She had no food allergies. Tests revealed no virus, no infection, no injury, no internal bleeding, no salmonella, no botulism, no controlled substance abuse. Well, some, but nothing that would cause these symptoms, no needle marks and no detectable poison. Like the police, the doctors were stumped. Sometime later I read her poem. It was pretty bad, but I didn't think it was what made her collapse. Henry Colavita reviews Killing O'Carolan by Walt Pilcher. 5 stars, a worthy addition to a series of clever and humorous mysteries. Walt Pilcher has just released, or should I say unleashed, another in the series of Mark Fairley mysteries. Like those before Killing O'Carolan, this book is both clever and humorous, and it is a mystery you won't be able to solve until Mark Fairley does it for you. I'm a fan of the Mark Fairley series, and as long as Walt keeps writing them, I will continue to buy and read them.
The Accidental Spurt and Killing O'Carolan by Walt Pilcher chart the adventures of reluctant private eye Mark Fairley. However, they're not just private investigator stories. If you've encountered Walt Pilcher before, say in On Shallowed Ground, you will be wondering, as I was, can the creator of Dr. Barker's scientific metamorphical prostate health formula keep his writing feet on the earth for long enough to write a detective novel at all? Well, it turns out he can. Yes, I was surprised too. Not only can he spin a good yarn, but he can also create the sort of character in Mark Fairley that you can't help rooting for. Fairley is a capable sort of guy, but he flounders. No surprise, as he's been pitched into unfamiliar waters. Walt Pilcher is a master of both parody and the absurd, but there's a thread of reality running through the murder and mayhem in both these books that had me wondering how much had come from experience. So guess what I did when I had the chance to ask Walt? Well, that's right, I asked him. I started with the first book in the series, The Accidental Spurt, and this was my question. Walt, there's a thread of international espionage running through the story. Is it true to say you were drawing on your own experience to bring this to life? I'm not suggesting you worked in international espionage, of course, but I know you've worked in corporate management around the world. And this was Walt's response. Early in my business career, when I was young and didn't know much, my boss sent my wife and me to a fancy resort for a weekend where our main competitor was having a marketing and sales conference. I was supposed to spy on them while pretending to have a good time at the resort. I couldn't do it, it just seemed wrong. So I had a good time at the resort while pretending to spy. I don't recall my boss's reaction when I had practically nothing to report upon my return, but I suspect he was actually a little ashamed that he had sent me on such a mission in the first place. Corporate espionage is a real thing, of course, but with the internet and other resources, there are plenty of ways to figure out what your competition is up to without doing anything illegal or unethical. Over the years since that incident, I've relied on those tools to good effect. I have no experience with political or international espionage, but between my legitimate corporate experience and what's portrayed on TV, in the movies and in books, not to mention stories behind the news headlines, it's not difficult to write about those things with acceptable veracity. For me, it's like, I'm not a doctor, but I saw one on TV. Well, there was one thing in that answer that for me encapsulated the magic Walt Pilcher gets into his work. Having gone out with the intention to spy whilst pretending to have a good time, he ended up having a good time whilst pretending to spy. That's a Pilcher twist for sure. I went on to ask about Killing O'Carolan. You have some interesting military-based technology in this book, Walt. Without spoilers, is this based on real technology, or is it something you've thought up from scratch? This was his reply to that one. It is imaginary, but the verisimilitude comes from the fact that there are indeed military-grade weapons based on lasers and electromagnetic pulses, EMPs, that can be devastating. Why not combine them and simultaneously hint that there may even be other ingredients in the resulting ray or energy beam, that the mix and intensity can be varied for different desired effects? Interestingly, in the accidental spurt too, a strange ray or energy beam figures quite importantly in the plot, as the Spur Nutritional's chairman, Mr. Z, falls victim to it early on, and other effects are suspected as the story unfolds. I never set out to use similar energy beams or rays in both books, but then I can't claim I have total control over these stories either. Sometimes they write themselves. If there is a follow-on to Killing O'Carolan, I will try and come up with something different, but no promises. I presume they're reading my books in the Pentagon and M.A.B.L.E. Wood, is that the UK equivalent? And will take appropriate weapons development action because of my ideas. I seek no fame or fortune from this, of course. I want to serve my country, just so they don't kill me because I know too much. Well, the fact that this answer sent me scurrying to check up on M.A.B.L.E. Wood to work out if it is the UK equivalent of the Pentagon, and by the way I still don't know, typifies the way that Pilcher's writing sets you off on tracks at odd angles to the point in question. It put me in mind of something I once read in a review of his work. This is from Dr. Robert E. Murphy in a review published on Goodreads. Pilcher also introduces the idea of fictional non-fiction. A great idea, but after reading this book, you may realise that there is already a lot of fictional non-fiction out there. It just isn't labelled. But his is, meaning perhaps that his is actually non-fiction, fictional non-fiction. And that's the way he gets your mind going. Hop on and enjoy the ride.
An excerpt from Killing O'Carolan, a Mark Fairley mystery by Walt Pilcher, read by the author. Chapter 25. Mark Fairley speaking. On the way home from lunch, I called Lieutenant Blue and asked him about the witness lists. Of course, we checked the witness lists against each other. What did you think? We suddenly remembered it was something they mentioned at the police academy? Sorry, I know it's basic detecting 101, which is probably why I even thought of it. Well, actually, Emily thought of it. Anyway, what did you find? No joy there. Some of these people must go to every artsy event they can find. I get the part about mooching the refreshments and all, but I mean, when do they work? When do they find time to write their own poems and draw their pictures and stuff? Beats me, but would you mind if I take a look at the list myself? I've become a little more artsy in the last few days, and maybe something will jump out at me. I thought about what I had just said. It seemed all I was doing on this case so far was wandering around and hoping clues would jump out at me. They weren't going to keep on paying me much longer if I didn't start doing more than that. Okay, I'll email you the file this afternoon, said Blue, but in all honesty, I think you're barking at the wrong dog. Thanks, I'll have a look at it as soon as I can. By the way, Blue continued, the tests on Maury Milburn's ink came out negative. No poison. I expected that, but thanks. You still going to that poem thing tonight? Yes. Well, have a rhymin' time. Thanks, I'll try. Wow. Detective Lieutenant Marshal Blue of the Greensboro Police Department's oxymoronic Criminal Intelligence Squad made a joke. Sort of. Maybe there was hope for him after all. Blue's email came an hour later, but I couldn't spare the time to look at it just then because I needed to review and make notes on the poems submitted by the other members of the critique group that Ryman Stanza, the moderator, had sent out. I should have taken the time to Google how to critique a poem because it turned out to be one of the hardest things I have ever had to do in my life. There were 3 poems in addition to my little collection of haikus. The first one I looked at was by somebody named Eleanor Cuddy, who called it Springliness, spelled Springlyness. Springliness by Eleanor Cuddy. Mission bold from aft the cold of winter oft depressing, taking hold to slow unfold a season's reassessing. Twixt and tween it doth careen among the equinoxes, growing green, but not too keen for nature's fickle boxes. Soon there's calm like soothing balm, a springly reconciling, not like a bomb, but with aplomb, a happy domiciling. But comes some heat the calm to meet, another new upheaval, summer's torch about to scorch since early times primeval. Nothing stays for endless days, the seasons keep a-moving, but this one plays, the one I praise, it's spring that I'm approving. At first I was at a loss for what to say about this poem. For all I knew it was brilliant, and Eleanor Cuddy should be the next poet laureate of North Carolina. I should call the governor immediately to alert him, since he makes those appointments. It had an interesting story and progression of ideas and some good poetry type stuff in it, at least to my untrained mind, like aft, oft, and doth, apostrophes in places of cleverly omitted letters, omitted words and suffixes, but you know what they mean anyway, and lots of good rhymes. On the other hand, I couldn't help wincing at the way the word bomb was tossed in, so to speak, like she was reaching for a rhyme. It was jarring, like a bomb. The expression "a moving" seemed like it would be more at home in a cowboy song than in a statelier poem like this one. Keep a movin', Dan, don't you listen to him, Dan. He's a devil, not a man, and he spreads the burnin' sand with water. From Cool Clear Water by Bob Nolan came to mind. I looked it up. Also, although the word springly is okay as a made-up adjective, shouldn't the title noun springliness be spelled with an I, or springlines, like lovely becomes loveliness? Was poetic license involved here? I certainly don't want to mess with that, but maybe I'll hold off on calling the governor for now. The next one was called Poetry Heaven by Michael Brennan. Poetry Heaven by Michael Brennan. I wonder where old poems go to die. Or do they have a life that's not their own? A different fate from things of flesh and bone, not fade away nor vanish in the sky? Is poem heaven like the one we know, all imperfections edited, divine, all meter, rhyme, and cadence in a line, so close to God in perfect form and flow? Or maybe freedom reigns in such a place, with structure cast aside like shackles tossed away along with criticism's cost, as if abandon won't in fact abase. But truths once written never will be gone, not buried with their authors, they live on. Another nice progression with poetry-type incomplete sentences, good rhymes, an interesting central idea, and a good finishing thought. Somehow it seemed familiar, but maybe it was the form, not the content. I liked it. I later learned it was a sonnet, a form often used by Shakespeare and other famous poets, so it was in good company. However, again the governor would be spared a call. Finally I came to Athabasca by Sylvia Constance. I imagined her real first name was probably Jane, but she changed it for poetic reasons, although she could as easily have gone with different spellings of Jane, Jayne or Jaine, unless one syllable wouldn't cut it. Anyway, Athabasca by Sylvia Constance. Cool petals mounting forth indelibly, a wind for sixpence falling softly through panes and seas, with memories of youth, older now but smoothly. Where did we go? I know, right? Rattled branches reaching, forgotten vistas long remembered, and caution not forthcoming as one, but more and not in touch. Tangibly, daybreak, yes, no, leaning on the breast of time and longing. Why? What the heck was this? A lament on the plight of indigenous peoples in Canada? An homage to nature's beauty and diversity one hasn't fully experienced? A cry for help? Or a last-minute belching of words and phrases from a random poetry generator so as to be ready with something to take to a critique group meeting? I suspected the latter, but being a poetry novice, I was ready to give it the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I would learn something at the meeting. I hoped so. But forget about the governor. Sheesh! Melody Trudeau reviews Killing O'Carolan by Walt Pilcher. Killing O'Carolan by Walt Pilcher is an entertaining romp, light-hearted crime, suitable for all ages. Adult readers might get the rich vein of parody better than younger readers, and the latter might fall about more hysterically than the former at the slapstick. I loved it from all angles, but then I'm just an avatar. There are good folk and bad folk in this book, but hero Mark Fairley has his work cut out because, just as in real life, villains don't come with labels any more than good people do. And when someone comes with a label, that's the time to get suspicious and assume the label's wrong. This book also includes a mystery weapon, and one thing that's clear from the start is that one of the bad people has been using it. What we find out later is that the bad guy who first got his hands on the mystery weapon is not only really bad, but also not very bright. The fool tries out the weapon on himself. It isn't a great move, so then he displays his irredeemable badness by trying it out on a stray cat. The cat goes berserk and runs away, and that's the last we see of it. So of course I had to ask Walt Pilcher what happened. I realize no one in the book knows this, but cat lovers will wonder what became of the cat. And here's what Walt Pilcher replied. Like Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger, we all wonder about cats. During any given observation, is the cat there or is it not? And if there, is it dead or alive? Or is it both dead and alive? Who can say? That is my take on the substance of the famous thought experiment proposed by Schrödinger in 1935. And if the difficulty of wrapping one's mind around the question isn't bad enough, one must consider the experiment has to be performed at least 9 times, the number of cat lives, or deaths, before any reliable conclusions can be formed. Therefore, as for the cat in question, if in fact it ever existed at all and was not a figment of the bad guy's hallucinatory imagination after turning the weapon on himself, I can only imagine it is okay, or not, depending. Right. Well, I'm glad that's all cleared up. Walt Pilcher reviews his book, Killing O'Carolan by Walt Pilcher. Buy this book. I need the money. As the author, I assure you that you will like this book, but don't just take my word for it. Here's what the leading character, Mark Fairley, says. Read how I reluctantly go undercover in the arts community to learn who is poisoning poets in Greensboro by discovering whose muse has run amok so I can restore poetic justice to the city. And see what happens when I discover the future of this 21st century town may hinge on the story of a legendary 18th century blind itinerant Irish musician and a hitman with a chip on his shoulder. It's a hopelessly funny book with satire, irony, parody, lovable characters, and good spelling, grammar, and punctuation, so it is easy to read. With all that going for it, how can you not buy it? Now.